At my daughter's housewarming party, she blocked me at the front door and said, "You smell like sawdust and poverty. Leave before anyone sees you." That same night inside, she told her in-laws I had never contributed a single dollar to her life, while I had been quietly funding every piece of it. I stood in the dark outside the window and heard every word. I walked back to my truck. I looked at the box in my hands and I made a decision she never saw coming. My name is Warren Callahan. I am 60 years old and I work with my hands. It is the only way I have ever known how to work, and I make no apologies for it. For 37 years, every day since I was 23, I have shown up and put my hands to wood. It was my father who started it. He pressed a hand plane into my palm one afternoon and told me something I have never forgotten, that wood never lies to you. It shows you exactly what it is. Every knot laid bare, every flaw visible, every hidden grain running contrary to the direction you thought it would go. You either learn to read what the wood is telling you, or you ruin what you are working on. That is the whole of it. No room in between for wishful thinking, no mercy for the man who does not pay attention. There is no middle ground. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here today. If these stories have a way of finding you, when you need them, go ahead and tap subscribe. That way the next one comes straight to you. Before we begin, I'd love to know, when you sit down with a story like this one, what are you hoping to carry with you when it's over? Is it a lesson, a feeling, or something you can't quite name yet? Leave that in the comments. I read everyone. A note before we go further: this story contains fictional elements woven in for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters here is the truth underneath it. A cattle rancher outside Bend once paid me in cash and a firm handshake for a bedroom set. An architect up in Sun Valley sent a thank you note on stationery, heavier than most people's mortgage documents. A young couple in Medford, barely scraping together enough for the lumber, paid me in installments stretched across 8 months for a cradle I built them. I built it anyway. The wood does not ask to see your bank statement before it lets you work it. Neither do I. The one thing I have never found a way to build is the kind of life my daughter decided I ought to have. Nadia is 26 years old. She carries her mother's eyes and her mother's manner of entering a room, that certainty like she already has the floor plan memorized. Her mother, Rosalind, was taken by a brain aneurysm 12 years ago, a Tuesday in November, 40th minutes after she mentioned a headache, while she stood at the sink finishing up the breakfast dishes. Nadia was 14. I was 48. We have never fully come back from it, though each of us has found our own way to shoulder the weight. I lay all of this out because you need to know. The man who climbed into his truck and drove 4 hours through snow to Portland one evening, a wooden box on the seat beside him that had taken 3 weeks to make. Cedar. I had picked the plank myself. The grain had a figure in it, tilted toward the light at just the right angle, and 2 shapes seemed to lean toward each other. I laid a thin strip of walnut into the lid. Beneath a nest of cedar shavings inside the box, I had tucked something meant for Nadia, alone, away from her husband, away from his mother, away from whoever else would be filling her housewarming. I had held onto it for 2 years, waiting for a moment that felt worthy of it. I wore the good shirt, the blue one Rosalind had picked out for our 20th anniversary. I pressed it myself that afternoon. I am not a man who irons well, but I made the effort. The dashboard clock read 8:47. When I cut the engine in front of the house, I noticed, because after a long drive, your body wants some kind of marker, some confirmation that the moving is done. Every window in the place was burning with light. Cars crowded both sides of the street. A Range Rover, 2 Audis, something low and German that I could not name. Music pressed through the walls. Inside, through the large front window, I could make out clusters of people in dry, clean-only clothing, wine glasses, raised heads tilted back in laughter. I got out of the truck. I smoothed my shirt with one hand. I lifted the box and started up the front walk. I was halfway to the porch when the door swung open, and Nadia came out, a dark blue dress I had never laid eyes on, fitted the kind of price tag that would cover a month of my bills. Her attention was on her phone. Then she raised her eyes. What happened to her face in the next 2 seconds I had never seen before. 3 separate things moving through it fast. Surprise first. Then something close to pain. Then a hardness I did not yet have a word for. She came off those steps quickly, drawing the door nearly shut at her back. "What are you doing here?" Low-clipped, careful not to let the sound carry inside. I told her I had driven up for the party and lifted the box a few inches. "I made you something for the house." "Oh, you drove up." The way she said it, the flat repetition of a thing she could not believe she was hearing, landed somewhere in my ribs. Her gaze moved across me, face shirt truck sitting at the curb. Something in her expression went tight, and so did something in my chest. Dad. She moved closer and brought her voice down further. Look at yourself. I did. The shirt was pressed. The boots were clean. My hands will always be what they are, the hands of a man who has used them hard for a long time. Knuckles swollen from years of grip skin, like worn leather, a line of stain along the edge of my right thumbnail that has lived there so long I have stopped noticing it until someone else does. You smell like sawdust and poverty. Her jaw was set like a seam of hardwood. You drove 4 hours in that truck, and you're standing in front of my house where my in-laws are inside right now. Nadia, you cannot come in. Final. No softness in it, no opening. I need you to leave before somebody spots you out here. My grip went tighter around the box. I just wanted to bring you a gift. I don't want the gift. Both her palms came flat against the side of the box and shoved, and it twisted out of my hands and dropped onto the bottom porch step. The corner caught the concrete edge, and a crack opened along the lower lip of the lid, clean, definitive like a line scored with a chisel. We both stood looking at it. Go home, Dad. Barely above a whisper now. Please just go home. She went back up the steps and through the door, and did not turn around. The latch sounded behind her. I stayed where I was for a moment on the front walk. Then I crouched and picked the box back up. My thumb found the crack and traced it. The cedar beneath was solid surface damage, only nothing that touched the structure, something I could mend. Instead of heading back to the truck, I went around the side of the house. I could not have told you exactly why. I said to myself I only wanted to be certain she was all right. The real answer, I think, was that I was not yet ready for the long cab of that truck and all that quiet. Along the side wall there was an uncurtained window, and through it I had a clear line into the main room. Nadia was moving through the crowd now, her face remade into something open and warm. Near the center of the room, champagne flute in hand, stood a woman I knew, Vivian Wexford. Colin's mother, who had once toured my workshop and applied the word rustic with the same delicacy some people reserve for unfortunate. The music was up enough that the words were lost at first. Then it dipped, and the voices came through the glass. Vivian Wexford was putting a question to Nadia. Nadia's chin went up, shoulders drew back. I knew that stance she had taken it at 14 when a teacher pressed her in front of the whole class, and she had resolved not to let anyone see her waver. Then her answer came through clearly enough. Every single dollar came from me. I built this through my role as director of operations, my dad's side of the family. A pause, something shifted in her face, unreadable through glass at that distance. They were never in a position to contribute anything. The room gave back a warm murmur of admiration. I looked down at what I was holding, the box, the crack in the lid. I watched through that window a moment longer, Nadia easy now laughing, inhabiting a room she had made clear I had no part in. Then I walked to the truck, set the box on the passenger seat, turned the key. I eased away from the curb heading west toward the highway, toward the 4 hours of dark road that ran between Portland and Oregon. Radio stayed off. I never stopped for coffee. I just drove. 37 years of learning to read wood. And here is the thing about wood. You study the face of it and you believe you have taken its measure. Then your blade goes in and the grain veers somewhere you did not account for, and the whole plan shifts. I believed I understood my daughter. I stood at that side window for maybe 4 minutes, long enough for the cold to find its way through my shirt, long enough for what I was hearing to make my hands go absolutely still on the box. Vivian Wexford placed her flute on a side table and squared herself to face Nadia. The room took on that particular texture, a gathering of people performing in attention while attending to every syllable. The house, Vivian said. Her voice had the easy reach of someone who has never once needed to work at being heard. Center of Portland. What your husband tells me you put down for this place. That is a serious sum for someone your age, Nadia. Help me understand. Did anyone in your family contribute? I watched my daughter's spine go straight. That posture. I had seen it once before at Rosalind's funeral, when the pastor asked if she had words to say, and she had crossed to that podium at 14 years old and spoken for 7 minutes without her voice breaking once. I'm my family, Nadia said, and the word landed with a small, careful weight. My father's side was not in a position to contribute. My father is a woodworker in Oregon. She let the silence sit for just a beat. This house came from my salary. I have been building toward it for 3 years through my work as director of operations. Every dollar of that down payment, every closing cost that came from me. The room gave back a warm murmur of approval. Someone reached out and touched her arm. Vivian Wexford smiled the way a person smiles when the answer confirms exactly what they were probing for. Colin stood 2 paces behind Nadia, holding a glass of something, amber, nodding slowly in the way a man does when he has concluded that making himself small is the wisest available option. I dropped my eyes to the box in my hands. Tucked beneath the cedar shavings inside was a cashier's check made out to Nadia Ann Callahan Wexford, $38,000. I had sat down across from a bank teller named Marlene 11 days earlier on a Thursday morning, and she had processed it without remark and passed it back to me in a plain white envelope. That same afternoon I drove home and laid it flat inside the box pressed under the shavings, and I had not breathed a word of it to anyone. Not to Gil. Not to a single person. I had covered 4 hours of road to put that check in her hands so she would not have to keep carrying what I was fairly certain she was already carrying. I closed my eyes once opened them. Through the glass, Nadia was laughing at something a guest had said. Her head fell back. One hand came up and rested lightly on the guest's wrist, the way Rosalind used to touch people when she wanted them to feel the conversation belonged to them alone. Something moved through my chest that I did not have language for at 60 years old. Not anger, not grief, not exactly either. Something that occupied the space between the two and had an edge to it. I went back to my truck, set the box on the passenger seat and studied it a moment. The cracked corner, the walnut inlay catching the glow of the nearest street lamp. The figure in the cedar grain that had always looked to me like 2 people standing very close. Then, I reached across, opened the glove compartment, and took out the white envelope. I slid it free of the box and returned it to the glove compartment, closed it, started the engine. Oregon is 4 hours and 11 minutes from Portland if you drive straight through. I drove straight through. East of the city, the road rises up through the Cascades and then descends into high desert, and on a clear December night, the stars over eastern Oregon are so thick and so utterly indifferent to human affairs that for a moment, just a moment, they can make whatever is pressing on you feel almost manageable. They did not make it feel manageable that night, but I looked at them anyway. I got home at 1:17 in the morning. I let myself into the workshop, pulled the chain on the overhead light, and set the box on the bench. I tore off a piece of fine sandpaper and worked the cracked corner until the broken edges lay smooth. Then I drew a thin bead of hide glue along the seam, set 2 small clamps, and left it to cure through the night. A crack caught early enough can be fixed. Done properly, the repair holds stronger than the original. The glue line becomes the toughest part of the joint. The scar stays, though. You can always find the place where it opened, but it holds. I went to bed. I lay looking at the ceiling in the dark for a long time. Come morning, Gil rapped on the workshop door at 7 with 2 cups of coffee from the convenience store down the road, which is the kind of coffee that tastes like it was poured from a pot that had been sitting since before dawn and which I have been drinking alongside him for 19 years. He studied my face and said, "How was Portland?" I took the cup. "Cold," I said. He nodded once. We drank in the open air. First light was edging over the ridge, laying a copper color across the snow on the workshop roof. Gil's eyes went to the box on the bench, to the thin line of glue along the repaired corner. He did not press. When 2 men have known each other long enough, the shape of a situation communicates itself without much help from words. Gil Pruitt has been my closest friend for 19 years. He runs the hardware and lumber supply 2 miles down Route 62 from my shop, which means he has been pricing my materials at cost since roughly the 2nd year. I knew him while calling it the going rate. I have never raised the point. Some forms of generosity are best received without ceremony. He settled onto the stool by the workbench that morning, same as every morning, same cup from the same place down the road, and said nothing about Portland. That is something I have always been grateful for in Gil. He knows the difference between silence that is asking to be broken and silence that should be let alone. After a time, I told him anyway. I told him about the front walk, the porch, the box dropping against the step. I told him about the window and the voices carrying through the glass. I told him what Nadia had said about the down payment, about her salary, about the family that had never been in a position to contribute. Gil listened all the way through without a word. When I finished, he turned his cup slowly between his hands. "How long has this been building?" he asked. I had to think on it. It had begun 4 years back when Nadia called me 3 weeks after her wedding to say she and Colin had found a place they wanted to buy in Portland, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood she described as up and coming, which I came to understand meant already expensive and accelerating. The asking price was beyond what they could reach together on their incomes. Colin had recently walked away from a sales position and was, in Nadia's words, exploring options. Her salary as an office coordinator covered rent, but not much else. She asked whether I could help with the down payment. I want to be honest about what I felt then because I think it matters. I felt glad. I had money put away, not a fortune, but enough accumulated over years of simple living and charging fair prices for work that had gradually found its people. The notion of giving some of that to my daughter so she could own something, so she could have the kind of footing her mother and I had taken years to build before Rosalind died, that felt correct. It felt like money serving the purpose money is supposed to serve. On a Tuesday morning, I wired her $62,000. It took care of the down payment and left a margin for closing costs and some early breathing room. Nadia called when the transfer arrived. She wept, which she almost never does, and I sat in the workshop holding the phone to my ear listening, and felt something I had not felt since Rosalind was alive, the particular irreplaceable satisfaction of being genuinely useful to someone you love. After that, I sent money when she asked. Not every time there were requests I declined a vacation she had in mind, a car Colin had been eyeing, but the steady support I kept going because her salary was lean, and his income came in fits, and I told myself I was helping them build towards something solid. What I was blind to across all 4 of those years was how that money appeared from the outside. I had no idea Nadia had told Vivienne Wexford the house was entirely her own doing. I had no idea she had described her position at work as director of operations rather than the office coordinator role she actually held. I had no idea that the dinner parties, the furniture, the wardrobe, things I had taken to be within ordinary reach for 2 young people in Portland, were being quietly supplemented by what I wired each month. Vivienne Wexford had been at the wedding. She had stood in the reception hall wearing something that probably cost more than my truck and regarded me with the look of a person who has sorted you into a drawer and found no occasion to reconsider. She had asked what I did. I told her I worked with wood. She said, "How lovely," and turned away to someone else. It had not bothered me. I have never required people like Vivienne Wexford to hold me in any particular regard. What was sitting with me that morning in the workshop beside Gil was something I was only just beginning to name. She wasn't hiding the fact that she needed help, I said, taking my time with the words. She was hiding the fact that I existed. Gil set his cup down on the bench. He looked at me for a moment. "Warren," he said. What was inside the box? I looked at the repaired corner. The glue line had set overnight smooth and tight. You had to know where to look to find it. "Something I should have put in her hands a long time ago," I said. "And something I should have stopped putting in her hands a long time ago." Gil picked his cup back up. Outside, the snow from overnight was letting go of the workshop roof running past the window in a thin, uneven curtain of drips. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I reached for a piece of sandpaper and turned to the cedar block I had been working the morning before I drove to Portland. It was the beginning of a side table for a client in Ashland. Simple lines, clean joinery. Work that demands your full attention if you want it to come out right. "I'm going to wait," I said. Gil nodded, as though that was precisely what he had anticipated. My phone buzzed against the workbench. I looked down Nadia's number. I let it ring. She called again at noon. Then at 2:17, then at 4:51, which was when I finally answered. I was midway through fitting a mortise joint on the Ashland table, sawdust on my forearms, carrying the particular focused irritation of a man who has cut a joint a hair too wide and knows he is going to have to start the piece over. I picked up because I have never managed sustained avoidance well. It feels like a kind of dishonesty, and I find that harder to live with than whatever conversation I am trying to dodge. Dad, clipped, not contrite, not the voice of someone who had lain awake thinking about a wooden box with a cracked corner on a porch step. "I need you to wire me $20,000 by Friday." I set the chisel on the bench. "Good afternoon, Nadia," I said. "I'm serious. I don't have time for..." She stopped, exhaled. "Please, it's urgent. What's the money for Bill's maintenance on the house?" Some things came up. I looked at the mortise joint. The gap ran maybe a 1/16 of an inch too wide. Invisible to anyone who did not know what they were looking at, large enough that within a year the joint would loosen, the table would develop a wobble, and eventually the whole thing would give. "I don't have $20,000 to send you," I said. The silence on her end had weight to it. Not disbelief, something more, like the sound of a person running new numbers in her head. You just sent me $62,000 2 years ago. I did. That was money I had been setting aside for a long time towards something that mattered. There is no second pool sitting behind it, waiting to be drawn from. Dad? The clipped register dropped away, and something harder moved in under it. Colin is between positions right now. The house is costing more to keep up than we planned for. I need help. What is Colin doing about being between positions? Pause. He's looking. How long has he been looking? That's not... She pulled herself back. That's not what this call is about. I know what the call is about. I picked the chisel back up and turned it over in my hand. I'm telling you, I don't have it. And if I did have it, I would want to understand what became of the breathing room I built into the money I already sent you. The line went quiet in a way that meant she had no answer she was willing to offer. You're being selfish, she said, finally her voice gone flat and measured. I needed you, and you have never once made it easy to need you. She ended the call. I stood at the bench for a while. Then I picked up the mortise piece and looked at the joint one more time. I set it in the scrap pile. Some things cannot be corrected with a shim or a compensating cut. You bring out a fresh piece and you begin again. What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, was what Nadia did in the 48 hours after she put the phone down on me. On a Thursday morning, she found Quill Private Lending, LLC. The office occupied the 14th floor of a building in downtown Portland, which I know because she eventually described it to me in fragments the way people describe things they carry shame about. Clean waiting room, framed certificates on the walls, a receptionist who offered coffee. Harriet Quill was 58 years old, precise in the way that comes from decades of watching informal arrangements dissolve into disputes. She ran a licensed private lending operation, Quill Private Lending, LLC, regulated under Oregon State Department of Financial Institutions rules. She did not extend money to borrowers who could not put up an asset to secure it. Nadia had an asset. The loan was $38,000. The interest rate was 18% per year, compounding monthly legal under Oregon state law for licensed private lenders working under signed commercial agreements. The monthly payment came to $100. The term was 36 months. The collateral was the house. Harriet Quill walked through every term in plain, clear language before Nadia signed anything. I say this because Harriet Quill is the kind of lender who walks through every term in plain, clear language before anyone signs anything. She has no appetite for legal disputes and every interest in being made whole. Nadia signed on a Thursday afternoon. She called Colin from the elevator on the ride down. I got the money, she told him. How much, he asked. Enough, she said, to fix everything. Colin asked nothing further. He was watching something on his laptop when she walked through the door, and he looked up long enough to nod before looking back down. None of this reached me on the Thursday it happened. I was in the workshop cutting a fresh piece of oak for the ashland table, working the mortise again from the start, getting it right. Gil came by at 5 with a bag of hardware, some brass hinges I had ordered for a cabinet job coming up the following month. He set the bag on the bench and glanced at the scrap pile. Starting over, he said. Joint was off, I said. He nodded. He knew that sometimes that is the only honest answer. What neither of us understood yet was that $38,000 had just been borrowed against a house I had paid for by a daughter who had told a room full of people that I did not exist. The weeks following that phone call were quiet on my end. I finished the ashland table, packed it in moving blankets on a Tuesday, and loaded it into a rented trailer. The client called that evening to say it had come through undamaged and that his wife had wept when she saw it, which seemed to move him and bewilder him in roughly equal measure. I told him that was generally a promising sign. He laughed and allowed that it probably was. I picked up 2 new commissions, a writing desk for a professor in Medford, and a set of kitchen cabinets for a couple outside Grants Pass, who had been on my list for 14 months. The cabinet work was substantial enough to carry me through February. I ordered lumber. I drew out measurements. I worked. I did not call Nadia. She did not call me. Gil came by on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after Portland, the way he does, when something has been occupying his thinking long enough that it needs to come out. He brought coffee. He took the stool. He looked at the box sitting on the upper shelf I had put it there, after repairing the lid in the spot where I keep finished pieces that have not yet found a reason. You ever going to tell her what was inside it? He asked. When she asks about it, I said, she would have to know to ask. She knows the box exists. I drew a hand plane along the cabinet face frame I was working. She's the one who knocked it off the step. Gil wrapped both hands around his cup. Outside, the temperature had fallen overnight, and the snow coming on was the dry, fine sort that refuses to stick, but keeps falling regardless. "Warren," he said. "I looked something up. I kept the plane moving. What did you look up foreclosure rates in Multnomah County, Oregon State?" He paused. "They've been climbing. Private lending defaults mostly. People who borrowed against their homes when the terms seemed manageable and then found they could not sustain the payments. I set the plane down. She borrowed against the house. I said it without a question mark. I don't know that for certain," Gil said carefully. "What I know is she needed $20,000 badly enough to call you 3 times in a single afternoon. I know Colin hasn't held a full-time job in over 2 years. I know the house carries costs that her salary alone won't cover." He looked down at his cup. "I'm not saying I know. I'm saying I'd want to know if it were me." The cabinet face frame lay on the bench between us. Straight grain, tight joints, still carrying the smell of the mill. That Grant's Pass job had been one I was genuinely eager to get to. Good people, that couple they had put 3 years of savings into commissioning it. But I stayed on the cabinet frame and spoke without looking up. If she pledged the house as security and then stops making payments, I said the lender moves on the collateral, Gil said. The place gets sold at auction. Any equity that survives the loan balance and the fees goes to her if anything clears at all. I drew the hand plane 3 times along the face frame before I said another word. Practically nothing would be left, I said. Between my original contribution and what a private lender compounds over a default period at market rates, she would walk away with close to 0. Gil nodded. He is not the kind of man who reaches for, "I told you so." That is part of why 19 years have gone by and we are still drinking bad coffee together. "So what comes next?" he asked. "Same as before," I said. "I work, I wait." "Warren, that is not a plan." "No," I said. "It isn't. It's a decision. There's a gap between those 2 things." He drained his cup, got to his feet, and balanced it on the edge of the bench, the way he always does, like he's leaving a small reservation on the morning. He stopped before he went through the door. "Call Elliot Voss," he said. "Nothing has happened yet, but you should know your footing before something does." Elliot Voss was a local attorney. I had needed him twice a supplier dispute 8 years back, and then again when I revised my will after Rosalind died. Steady, straight, and priced fairly, which sounds ordinary until you have dealt with enough lawyers to know it isn't. I phoned him that same afternoon and laid out the situation as best I could, which was imperfectly since everything I knew was second-hand inference. Elliot heard me through. "If the property was pledged as collateral on a private loan," he said, "and your daughter defaults on that loan, the lender's legal claim against the house stands ahead of any unwritten understanding about who put the money in. Your contribution is not documented as a loan. It was a gift. The law gives you nothing. I'm not after the property," I said. "I understand that," he said, "but you need to understand your position clearly. If you were to step in and pay off some of her debt to head off a foreclosure, could that come back on me?" He paused for a moment. "Possibly. Depending on how it was structured, a lender could make the case you had taken on guarantor liability. That could leave you exposed to claims from any future default or associated dispute. My advice would be to do nothing without a proper written agreement in place first." "I understand," I said, and ended the call. Back at the cabinet frame, I kept my hands moving until the window went dark. The wood behaved. Joints were clean and square, everything fitting the way it was drawn. My phone was quiet all night. What I did not yet know was that somewhere in Portland, Nadia had just let her 2nd consecutive payment to Harriet Quill go unmade. What happened next, I put together from Nadia herself. Months later, told to me in fragments the way people tell things they are still processing. I will give it to you, not in the sequence it happened, but in the sequence that lets it make sense. The envelope found her on a Monday. She told me she recognized it for what it was, before she even broke the seal. The return address said, Quill Private Lending, LLC, and the weight of the paper alone announced that nothing inside was casual. Colin was still in bed. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. It was a formal notice of default filed under Oregon state lending law, informing Nadia that she was 62 days past due on the Quill Private Lending LLC obligation. The document was clear if the full amount, including accrued interest and all accumulated late fees, was not received within 30 days. Harriet Quill's legal counsel would initiate a judicial foreclosure petition at Multnomah County Circuit Court. Judicial foreclosure in Oregon state runs through the court rather than bypassing it. The process is slower than a direct sale, but it is the path private lenders take when their contracts carry no power of sale clause. A judge examines the record, enters judgment, and orders the property sold at public auction. Start to finish, that sequence typically consumes several months. 30 days, the letter said. Nadia placed it face down on the counter. She said the kitchen felt sharp and too bright, the kind of loud that has nothing to do with sound. She went to the bedroom and woke Colin, handed him the letter. He worked through it twice, which she had not expected. Then he set it on the nightstand. "Call your dad," he said. She told him she had already been down that road. He reached for his phone and started scrolling. She told me that was the moment it settled over her, that she would have to find the way out herself. 2 hours passed. She was still at that counter when her phone lit up with an Instagram notification, a tag. She tapped it on reflex. Petra Morrow had posted from the company team lunch. 5 people, a restaurant table, somebody's half-finished meal edging into the frame, the sort of snapshot taken, because the algorithm expects proof of a social life. Petra had tagged the whole table. Under Nadia's face in small, tidy type, it read, "Nadia Callahan, Wexford Office Coordinator." Nadia went, still looking at it. She told me her mind did not go first to Vivian Wexford. It went to the party, to her own living room, to the circle of her husband's family, nodding along, as she told them she ran operations for the company, to the particular way Vivian had smiled. She pulled the tag off her own profile inside 4 minutes. Not fast enough. Vivian Wexford followed Nadia online and checked with the dedication of someone who treats a social feed as intelligence. She had already taken it in. Nadia had no idea. She would not find out until Vivian rang her doorbell 3 days later. There was something else she did not know that afternoon. The same post had landed in front of someone in her company's HR department, a woman named Irene Cassell, who handled personnel files and followed Petra's account because they had overlapped 2 positions ago. Irene clocked the mismatch between the tag and the title Nadia had been using inside the company director of operations, listed that way in her employee profile, her email signature, and 3 internal documents. Irene forwarded it upward with 1 sentence. "Does anyone want to look at this?" Someone did. Nadia's file was under review by 4 o'clock. She walked to her car that evening, knowing none of it. What she carried was the notice of default sitting on the counter at home, the deleted Instagram tag, the awareness that Colin had spent the afternoon on his phone and had not brought the letter up again. She dialed me from the parking structure. I was latching the workshop for the night when it rang. I checked the screen. I picked up. "I need you to tell me there's something you can spare," she said. Compressed, held tight, a voice doing work to keep itself level. "Anything. 10,000, 5,000, I'll pay you back. Nadia, please." The please came out stripped raw, without the clipped efficiency she had wielded on me 3 weeks before. "Dad, please." I lowered myself onto the shop stool. The overhead bulb threw its yellow cast across the bench, across the tools, across the cabinet frames, standing where I had left them. "Tell me what happened," I said. She walked me through the letter. Not the Instagram post, not Irene Cassell, not the HR flag. Either she had not yet put those pieces together, or she was not ready to say them aloud. The letter, the 30 days, the dollar figure. I let her finish without a word. Then I said, "I talked with Elliot Voss a few weeks back about exactly this kind of situation." Silence. "Who is Elliot Voss?" "My attorney. He told me that covering any part of a secured debt you owe a private lender could be read under Oregon state law as assuming guarantor status, which would make me liable for any future claims attached to that debt." The quiet on the line had texture. "So you won't help me," she said. "I can't help you the way you're describing," I said. "Those aren't the same statement." The line went dead before I got a word of explanation out. I stayed in the workshop a good while after that, just sitting. The cabinet frames were there ready and waiting. My hands never touched a tool. Through the window, the Oregon night pressed in clear, and punishing the kind of freeze that pulls the stars down, close makes them look near enough to reach. Vivian Wexford gave no warning she was coming. Nadia described it to me in that particular drained tone people use when something happens that proves a fear they had been quietly carrying. 3 days after the Instagram post, at 8:43 in the morning, the bell rang at the front door. Nadia answered it, still wearing what she had slept in, a full coffee cup dangling from one hand, and there was her mother-in-law on the porch camel wool coat phone already raised. No greeting, just the screen thrust forward. Petra's Instagram post blown up into a screenshot. Nadia's face ringed in the image, the tag right below it. Office coordinator. I want to understand something, Vivian said. Everything about her delivery was measured unhurried, the register of someone whose mind is already made up, and who is now building the record. She said Colin had assured her more than once that Nadia held a director of operations title, and she had taken him at his word. She had passed that along to people whose opinion mattered to her. She set the phone down at her side. She wanted to know, she said, what exactly it was she had been telling them. Nadia felt her throat go tight. She told me later she was aware of the cup handle biting into her palm, her grip too rigid to ease. It's complicated, Nadia said. Looks straightforward to me, Vivian answered. Looks like a job title. Colin materialized in the hallway behind Nadia. No shoes, saying nothing, assessing the room the way he always did, at his own unhurried pace and without offering anything. Mom, come in. Vivienne came in. She took a chair at the kitchen table and laid her phone face up on the surface in front of her, like something submitted into evidence. She studied Nadia and let the silence do its work, the steady patience of a woman who had spent 55 years extracting the truth from people simply by waiting them out. Nadia talked. Not the whole of it, not the loan, not the notice of default, not the 30-day window. Just the title. She said she had represented herself at a higher level in certain settings, because the work she actually did had outgrown her official classification. She said the practice was common in her field. She said she had intended to make it official. Vivienne let her finish without a flicker of reaction. Your father, she said then, the woodworker up in Oregon, did he put money into this house? The question hit like a sudden drop in pressure. No, Nadia said. Vivienne nodded, slow and deliberate. Interesting, because I have a clear memory of you telling me at the housewarming that your family had contributed nothing, and I find myself wondering now whether that is also a beat, the word chosen precisely. Complicated. Colin's gaze dropped to the floor. His jaw moved like he was working through something that had no taste. Nadia's phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. She looked over at it without thinking. The banner across the top read, HR services important. Please see email regarding your employment status. The bottom fell out of her stomach. She grabbed the phone and rotated away from Vivienne, not smoothly, not subtly. And Vivienne clocked it because Vivienne clocked everything. Nadia pulled up the message. It had come from Irene Cassell, HR manager. Subject line, employment record review, action required. The email laid out that a discrepancy had been flagged between her official job classification and the title appearing in various internal records and her employee profile. The timestamp showed it had been sent 2 days prior, the same afternoon Petra's post went live, but it had been rerouted into Nadia's notifications folder and sat there unseen. Citing company policy section 4.2 HR had escalated the matter for formal review. She was required to appear before HR the next morning. Until the review concluded, she was on paid administrative leave effective immediately. She read through it a second time. Nothing shifted. Nadia. Vivian's voice right at her back. What is that? Nadia turned. Vivian was still in her coat, watching Nadia's face, and whatever had been suspicion in her expression had hardened now into something beyond it. It's a work thing, Nadia said. Nothing urgent. You've drained of all color, Vivian said. That does not look like nothing. Colin pushed back from the table and stood. He walked over and set his hand on Nadia's arm, the firmest, most deliberate move she had seen from him in longer than she could say. She told me she registered it in that instant, even there in the middle of everything, because it was not like him at all. Mom, he said, can you give us a few minutes? Vivian looked at him, looked at Nadia. Then she lifted her phone from the table, tucked it away in her coat pocket, and moved toward the front door. I expect a conversation, she said, once you've chosen to have one. The door opened, she went through it, and it closed behind her, not hard but with a precise, controlled finality that landed heavier than any slam would have. Colin faced Nadia. His hand hadn't left her arm. Tell me how bad, he said. She looked at the email still pulled up on her screen. Then at the notice of default that had been sitting face down on the counter for 3 days exactly where she had placed it. Then at Colin, and the look on his face was one she hadn't seen in a very long time. A person so unnerved that he had gone still, entirely present in a way that fear, and only fear, had managed to produce in him. It's bad, she said. His hand came away from her arm. He lowered himself back into his chair and stared at the table for a long, wordless stretch. And then he spoke the sentence that told Nadia more plainly than anything that had come before what manner of person she was married to. "What are we going to do?" "Not me. We." Nadia nearly laughed. She told me so afterward, that she had come within a breath of laughing and that she was never quite able to account for why she pulled back from it. She booked 2 seats on a flight to Medford, Oregon, leaving the next morning. Getting to the airport was not without its complications. Nadia told me they were bags by the door and ready by 7:15. That morning, 2 carry-ons, a leather duffel of Colin's that he had insisted on bringing, despite her telling him they were not going somewhere that required a leather duffel, and a canvas tote she had packed with folders, because even when everything is coming apart, she organizes in ways I have always recognized as her mother's. They were dragging their things into the front hallway when the doorbell went. Colin looked at Nadia. Nadia looked toward the door. On the porch stood a man in a charcoal suit jacket over a blue Oxford shirt, no tie, a leather messenger bag slung across one shoulder, a manila folder in hand. Medium height, medium frame, and a face that gave away nothing in any direction. Not warm, not cold. Just there. The badge on his jacket said, Harfield and Associates Debt Resolution, LLC. Nadia opened the door. "Mrs. Callahan Wexford," he said. "My name is Ned Harfield. I represent Harfield and Associates Debt Resolution on behalf of Quill Private Lending, LLC. He extended the folder toward her. "I'm delivering these documents to you directly in person. Oregon state law mandates personal service for judicial foreclosure proceedings." Her hand reached out and took the folder before she had made any conscious choice to do so. Inside, a summons and complaint. The official court filing opening judicial foreclosure proceedings against her in Multnomah County Circuit Court. A summons is the court's formal notification that a legal action exists. The complaint sets out what the lender says is owed and the basis on which they claim their right to remedy. Read together, these papers confirmed that Harriet Quill had followed through on every word of her notice of default. Nadia had 30 days to submit a formal reply to the court. "You have the right to contest this action," Ned Harfield said, in the flat, even cadence of a man who deals in facts and not in judgments. "The paperwork includes contact information from Multnomah County Circuit Court Self-Help Center, in case you need guidance on your options. Do you have any questions about the documents I've given you?" Nadia's throat had narrowed to almost nothing. She shook her head. Ned Harfield gave a small nod. He reached into the messenger bag and drew out a business card which he offered across to her. "If you engage an attorney and they need to reach our office, that number connects directly to our legal coordinator." He held her gaze for a moment, his expression unchanged. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this, Ms. Callahan Wexford. Have a good morning." He turned and made his way back down the front walk to a gray sedan waiting at the curb. He pulled away at a measured, unhurried pace. Nadia stayed in the open doorway, the folder in her hands, until Colin's hand came to her shoulder. "We need to go," he said. They made it to the airport. Nadia kept the folder in her lap the whole way through the security line. She stowed it in the overhead bin, then thought better of it and pulled it back down and kept it in her lap. Colin ordered a ginger ale he did not drink. The flight from Portland to Medford runs 1 hour and 38 minutes on a clear day. Nadia told me she spent the first hour with her forehead nearly against the window and the final 38 minutes reading the summons and complaint straight through from the first page to the last, something she had not been able to bring herself to do while still on the ground. Somewhere over the mountains, her phone lit up. She had switched to airplane mode, but forgotten to kill the Wi-Fi. It was an email from Irene Cassell in HR. She opened it. Subject line, update regarding administrative leave status. 4 sentences in the body. The company had completed a preliminary review of the discrepancy found in her employment records. That review had confirmed that her official classification office coordinator was not consistent with the title she had used in internal documents and communications. The matter had been passed to the Director of Human Resources. A formal decision on her employment status would follow within 5 business days. She turned the phone face down on the tray table. Colin was asleep against the window, the leather duffel presumably stowed somewhere above him, with appropriate care. His ginger ale still untouched in the cup holder. Nadia looked at the back of his head. She looked at the folder resting across her knees. She looked past him out the window at the mountains below, white and vast and entirely unmoved, the kind of terrain that has no interest in what the human world is doing inside its little pressurized cabins up above. That was the moment she began to cry, she told me, not with any sound. She pressed the back of her hand flat against her mouth and angled herself toward the aisle so the passenger across from her couldn't see. Her shoulders shook twice. Then she pulled a napkin from the tray table, held it hard against both eyes, and made herself stop. She did not cry again until she was standing inside my workshop. I know the shape of what came between. I know about the rental car in Medford and the 40-minute drive south on Route 62, and the way the valley spreads wide when you round that last curve before my road. I have made that drive myself several hundred times. What I did not know that morning was that any of this was headed my way. I was fitting hinges to the cabinet doors when I heard tires crunch across the gravel. I looked up. The car pulling in was a rental, one of those featureless silver sedans that airports turn out by the thousands, indistinguishable from one another, regardless of make. Nadia climbed out first, still in the clothes she had traveled in, hair pulled back the canvas tote on one shoulder, and the manila folder pressed flat against her chest, as though she feared what might happen if her grip loosened for even a moment. Colin came around from the passenger side with the leather duffel over his arm, taking in the workshop, the way people study. A place they have heard described but never actually seen, which told me everything I needed to understand about how many times my daughter had brought her husband home to meet me. I set the hinge down on the bench. Nadia pushed the workshop door open and came inside. The smell of sawdust and wood came at her the way it always does when you step in from outside, immediate, particular, total. The kind of smell that is so woven into a place that it cannot exist anywhere else. She stopped just inside, maybe 2 feet from the threshold. Her eyes moved around the room, the workbench, the tools on their outlines along the wall, the cabinet frames at the far end, the box on the upper shelf, and then settled on me. "Dad," she said. The word came out smaller than she had planned. I could hear the effort it was costing her to keep her voice level. "Nadia." I came toward her without hurrying. She needed a breath or two inside the room before anything else was going to happen. "We're in trouble," she said. "I know I have no right to come here. I know that, but we didn't have anywhere else to go. And her jaw pulled tight, the folder pressed harder against her chest. I didn't know what else to do. Colin came in behind her leather duffel, still over his arm, and looked at me with the expression of a man who understands he is not the central figure in this particular moment and is not entirely sure what to do with his hands. Gil was at the back of the workshop where he had been working through a hardware delivery for the past hour. He looked at Colin. He looked at the leather duffel. He turned back to his hardware without a word. I was drawing breath to speak when a second set of tires crossed the gravel. Nadia turned. Through the workshop window, we all saw it, a gray sedan, the same model as their rental, or near enough to make no difference, rolling to a stop behind their car. Ned Harfield stepped out, messenger bag on his shoulder, manila folder in hand. Nadia made a sound that didn't quite form into a word. "He followed us," Colin said. His voice had climbed in pitch and gone tight. "He didn't follow you," I said. I moved toward the workshop door. "Stay here." I went outside. Ned Harfield was coming up the gravel path at that same, even unhurried pace, the pace of a man who moves like that everywhere he goes. He saw me and adjusted his line slightly. "Mr. Callahan," he said. He identified himself Ned Harfield. Harfield? And Associates Debt Resolution, and extended his hand. I shook it because whatever the circumstances, the man was conducting himself properly, and there was nothing to be gained by treating him otherwise. "I have additional documents requiring acknowledgement of receipt from Ms. Callahan Wexford. I have an address on file for this location as her designated emergency contact." She listed this address herself. "Yes, sir," I said. "That's correct." I looked at the folder he was holding. "She'll receive those documents through counsel. Her attorney is Elliot Voss, based here in Oregon. If you leave me your card, I'll see that he reaches your office today." Ned Harfield considered that for a moment. Then he went into the messenger bag and produced a business card and held it out. I took it. "That's acceptable," he said. "Please make sure your daughter understands that the response window on the original summons continues to run regardless of whether she engages counsel. The clock doesn't pause." "Understood," I said. "I'll tell her." He gave a single nod, turned and walked back to his car. I watched him pull out and head toward the main road. When I came back inside, Nadia was standing in the exact spot where I had left her. Colin had located the stool near the bench and settled onto it with the leather duffel across his knees, looking like a man waiting on a connecting flight. He wasn't sure would come. Gil had gone back to sorting hardware, though his back was held straighter than that task required. "How did he know to come here?" Nadia asked. "You listed this address as your emergency contact when you signed the loan documents," I said. Something crossed her face that I recognized the particular discomfort of learning that a choice you made without much thought has grown into consequences you never imagined. "I called Elliot Voss this morning," I said. "Before you arrived. I want you to know that." She looked at me. "Why?" "Because I knew something was on its way," I said. "Not that it was you specifically, but I could feel it coming, and I needed to know where I stood before it got here." I put Ned Harfield's card into her hand. She examined it, then slid it into the folder without creasing it. "What did he tell you?" she asked. "The same thing he'll tell you," I said. "That you have 30 days to respond and the clock is already running." I picked the cabinet hinge back up from the bench and turned it slowly in my fingers. That there are things within my reach and things that are not, and that understanding the difference is what matters. Nadia pressed her lips together. Her eyes had gone very bright, the look she gets on the edge of crying or on the edge of anger. I have never been certain until the moment arrives which one is coming. Gil set a piece of hardware down on his bench with a quiet, deliberate sound. "There's coffee in the back," he said without turning around. "Anyone who wants it." Nobody moved for a moment. Then Colin got to his feet, leather duffel still over his arm, and said, "I'll take some." Gil had mentioned it the previous evening, while Nadia and Colin were getting settled in the spare room. He had drawn me aside near the back of the workshop, voice low. "Burke's coming tomorrow afternoon, 2:00. You still want to go ahead with that with them here?" I had held the thought for a moment. Burke comes when Burke is scheduled. I don't rearrange my work because my personal life has become complicated. Gil had given me the look he reserves for when he believes I am being deliberately obstinate and technically correct in equal measure, a look I have been on the receiving end of for 19 years and have long since learned to accept without argument. So at 1:58 the following afternoon, the Range Rover came up the gravel drive and parked with the particular unhurried precision of a man who is never late and feels no need to hurry. I was at the bench with the Grants Pass cabinet doors laid out before me. Nadia was on a stool near the window, working through her court documents for what I judged to be the 4th time. Colin was standing near the door, with a cup of coffee he had been nursing for the better part of 2 hours. Gil came in from the lumber shed. "That's Burke," he said to no one in particular. Burke Ingstrom was 52 years old, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been athletic and had since redirected that energy into other pursuits. He had on a flannel-lined canvas jacket over a collared shirt, the sort of clothes that cost considerably more than they appear to, and he carried a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. He had driven up from a project site outside Medford, which was why he had asked for the afternoon slot. He shouldered the workshop door open and stepped in, and his face settled into that expression it always did when he entered a kind of concentrated pleasure, the way a musician looks when a room has good acoustics. "Warren." He took my hand in both of his the way he always did. "I have been turning this table over in my mind for 6 months. I want to see it." I walked him to the back of the workshop, where the dining table sat, finished on sawhorses ready. It was 8 ft long, book-matched from a single walnut slab. I had been aging for 3 years, with hand-cut mortise and tenon joints at the base, and a surface I had finished with 5 coats of oil rubbed in by hand over 12 days. Burke set his portfolio down and laid both palms flat on the surface. He drew them slowly from one end to the other. He crouched to examine the base joinery. He rose and stepped back to read the figure in the grain from 4 ft away. He said nothing for nearly a full minute. "This is the best thing you've made," he said at last, "in my opinion, and I have 4 other pieces of yours in my house." "I think you might be right," I said. He laughed short, genuine. He opened the portfolio and produced an envelope. 47,000 as agreed. And before I go, I want to talk through the Sun Valley project because I've sent 2 people your way, and I want to be certain the timeline is something you can actually hold. He handed me the envelope. I set it on the bench without opening it. Burke turned and seemed to register Nadia and Colin for the first time, though I suspected he had noted them the moment he walked in, and had simply been doing the considerate thing of not acknowledging strangers before they were introduced. "I'm sorry," he said warmly. "I didn't mean to walk into a family visit." "My daughter Nadia," I said, "and her husband Colin. Burke crossed to Nadia and took her hand. Burke Ingstrom, your father built a library wall for my home in Medford about 6 years ago. My wife still calls it the finest thing in the house, and she holds very firm views about the finest things in the house. He smiled. You have his eyes. Thank you. Nadia said the right answer, and her voice only caught slightly on the second word. Burke shook Colin's hand, and the two exchanged the brief mutually obligatory pleasantries of people who have nothing in common beyond a loose social overlap. Then Burke came back to the table, and we talked through the Sun Valley timeline for 15 minutes. On his way out, he stopped at the workshop door and looked back at the table on its sawhorses. I'm going to have it in the dining room before Thanksgiving, he said. I want to sit down to that first meal and think about every hour of work that went into it. He looked at me. 2 years on that waiting list, Warren, worth every single day. He left. The Range Rover went back down the gravel drive at the same measured pace it had arrived. The workshop went quiet. Colin set his coffee cup down on the bench. He looked at the envelope resting there, fat business-sized $47,000 mentioned by Burke, with the offhand ease of a man confirming a dinner reservation. He looked at Nadia. She was looking at the walnut table. I picked up the envelope and placed it in the drawer beneath the bench where I keep things I haven't dealt with yet. I'm going to get back to the cabinet hinges, I said. Nobody answered. I returned to the cabinet doors and picked up where I had left off. 10 minutes later, Gil touched my arm and tilted his head toward the door. I looked. Colin was outside in the gravel drive, phone against his ear body, angled slightly away from the workshop window. His free hand moved as he talked, the gesture of someone working through numbers. Gil looked at me. His mother, I said. That's my read too, Gil said. I went back to the hinges. The brass was cold and precise, each leaf seating exactly where it belonged. Colin came back inside 20 minutes later and said he was going to lie down for a while, the kind of statement designed to close a conversation rather than open one. He disappeared into the spare room with the leather duffel and his coffee cup, and that particular talent certain people possess for withdrawing from situations they have had a hand in creating. Nadia watched him go. Then she looked at me. I need to call Elliot Voss, she said. You mentioned him yesterday. Would he take my call? I'll introduce you, I said. Tomorrow morning, he opens at 8. She nodded and went back to her documents. I watched her for a moment. The way she held the pen, the way she drew a line under things she wanted to hold on to. I could see her mother in that gesture so plainly that I had to look away. Gil waited until we heard the spare room door close down the hall. Then he came and stood next to me at the bench. He looked up at the shelf where the cedar box sat, repaired corner walnut inlay, catching what was left of the afternoon light through the workshop window. 3 weeks since Portland, Fustate, he said. About 3 weeks since she borrowed the money, I said. Give or take. Gil was quiet for a moment. Warren, she is sitting 10 FT from you reading court documents. That box has been on your shelf since December. He let that sit. What are you waiting for? I picked up a brass hinge and turned it in my hand. The weight of it was familiar. Each leaf cleanly formed the pin running true through the center knuckle. She hasn't asked about it. She doesn't know to ask, Gil said, using the patient voice, the one that told me he had been sitting with this thought for a while and was holding himself back from pressing harder. She pushed it off the step and walked back inside. She has no idea what was in it. No, I said. She doesn't. And you're going to wait until she does something to deserve knowing. I set the hinge down. I'm going to wait until she's ready to hear it, I said. Those are different things. Gil looked at me for a long moment. Then he lifted his coffee cup and drank what remained, which by that point in the afternoon had gone fully cold, and which he finished anyway, the way he finished everything he started. You're a patient man, he said. I've been told that. A beat. It wasn't entirely a compliment. I called Elliot Voss at 4:30, while Nadia was in the kitchen putting something together to eat and Gil was loading the last of the hardware delivery into the supply cabinet. Elliot picked up on the second ring. I laid out where things stood. Nadia and Colin at the workshop, Ned Harfield's, visit the summons and complaint, the 30-day window already running. Has anything changed on your end, he asked. In terms of what you want to do, no, I said. But I want to be clear on one thing. If I offer Nadia a place to stay while this gets sorted out, food, shelter, nothing financial does that create any legal exposure for me. A brief pause. No, providing housing and meals to a family member creates no guarantor relationship with her creditors. You're not taking on any debt. You're simply not putting her out. Another pause. Which I want to note is a reasonable thing to do regardless of the legal picture. I know, I said, what you cannot do without risk is make any payment partial or otherwise toward the quill loan, the court fees, or any related debt instrument. What's coming next is the moment I had been quietly dreading when the weight of everything that had been set in motion finally arrived at my door in person. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved was heading toward real consequences for choices they made, would you step in to soften the landing or let things run their course? $1 even that could be read by a court as voluntary assumption of her debt. Understood, Warren. His tone shifted, still measured, but with the register of a man who has worked with you long enough to say the difficult part plainly. What's ahead of her is going to get rougher before any of it eases. The foreclosure, the HR review, whatever is fraying in her marriage, those things will come down on her, one by one, over the weeks ahead. She is going to need somebody standing with her who holds no claim against her. I know, I said. I thanked him and rang off. Looking through the kitchen doorway, I could make out Nadia at the counter, working through a bowl of something pulled from my refrigerator's documents beside her spoon, in hand reading and eating at the same time. She had shed her shoes somewhere along the way, standing in her socks on the tile the way she always did as a small child, whenever a problem was demanding her full attention. I went back to the hinges. At 6:45, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code told me something, 406, which belongs to Oregon, though the exchange was Medford rather than my end of the valley, I answered. Mr. Callahan. A woman's voice controlled, unhurried. This is Vivian Wexford. I'm calling because I believe, Warren, you are Nadia's father. That's right, I said. I'll be coming out to see you tomorrow morning. I landed in Medford this evening, rental car in hand. A pause followed that contained no uncertainty whatsoever. A face-to-face conversation would serve us both, I think. The workshop is open, I said. Wonderful. She let that word land with just enough warmth to signal she had gotten what she came for. Until tomorrow, Warren. The line went dead before I could say I went by Mr. Callahan. I put the phone down on the bench. Gil had been watching from the far side of the room. Vivian Wexford, I said, a slow nod from him. How long after Burke drove off before Colin picked up the phone? Do you figure 20 minutes, I said, give or take. Gil pulled his jacket from the hook by the door. I'll be here at 7, he said. You may want a witness. Gil arrived at 7 good, as his word carrying 2 cups of coffee from the convenience store down the road, which is the kind of coffee that tastes like it was poured from a pot that had been sitting since before dawn, and wearing the expression of a man who has shown up for enough hard mornings to know that the best thing he can do is take up a position near the wall and keep his mouth shut until called upon. Vivian Wexford pulled in at 9:14. A black SUV out of the Medford Airport pool, parked with the practiced economy of someone long accustomed to cities where every square foot of curb is a negotiation. She emerged in a charcoal wrap coat, leather gloves, boots that had cost more than one of my utility months. Hair arranged, bag with structure. After a flight, a hotel, and 40 minutes on the road, she presented as though she were stepping into a quarterly review. I went to meet her at the workshop door. Warren, a handshake, firm, dry, brief. Good of you to have me. Vivian, I said. Please come in. She entered. She did what every first-time visitor does in the workshop. Her gaze swept the room, cataloging, but where most people decelerate when they reach the finished work, drawn to linger on the walnut table, the cabinet doors, the cedar box on the upper shelf. Vivian's eyes moved at pace methodical, the scan of someone pricing a room rather than taking it in. Gil gave her a nod from near the supply cabinet. She acknowledged him with precisely the fraction of attention the situation required, and no more. Nadia had come into the back doorway, coffee cup cradled in both hands. Vivian regarded her daughter-in-law briefly. Then her eyes came back to me. I'd prefer to speak with you alone, if that's possible, she said. Nadia stays, I said. Something shifted behind Vivian's face. Not annoyance, not quite, but something adjacent to it held in check. She accepted the correction with a short, measured dip of the head. Of course, she said. Then let me be direct. Her bag went onto the corner of my workbench with the confidence of someone who sets things down in other people's spaces without giving it a thought. Warren, I don't think either of us is confused about what this situation has become. Nadia and Colin walked into certain choices, and the fallout from those choices is now finding people who never asked to be found by it. A beat. Yourself included. I don't see anything falling on me, I said. She produced a smile reserved for people who are being deliberately slow. Your daughter and son-in-law are sleeping under your roof. Debt processors are appearing on your gravel. Your life at this point in it, she cleared her throat lightly, I imagine looks rather different from what you had in mind. A slight tilt of the head. What I'm proposing is that this could be put behind everyone cleanly if handled with some directness. Tell me what that looks like, I said. She moved forward. Resources are not something you're short of. What Burke Ingstrom handed you yesterday would cover Nadia's balance and leave the two of them solid ground to stand on. She let the arithmetic sit between us. The foreclosure proceeding dissolves. The clock stops. Nadia and Colin go back to Portland and begin rebuilding their lives. And you, her hand swept lightly toward the room, get your workshop back. I studied that hand hanging in the air, gesturing at the bench where I have spent the better part of my working life. And your home, I said. You floated that idea when we spoke by phone. No flinch. My dining room has been waiting on the right table for years. Something simple if you were willing. No, I said, quiet, settled, a door finding its frame. Vivienne lowered her hand. Warren, I sat with my attorney this morning before driving out here. I said, if I direct a single payment any amount toward Nadia's balance with Quill Private Lending, I run the risk of being classified as a guarantor under Oregon state law. That would open me to whatever follows. I won't put myself there. I close my fingers around a brass hinge from the bench. And I don't do custom work as a favor for strangers. The room held its silence. Outside somewhere in the tree line, a woodpecker was at its work. Vivienne studied me for a long beat. Then her gaze moved to Nadia, still in the doorway, knuckles white against the mug. I see, Vivienne said. She retrieved her bag from the bench's edge. I'll give you credit for plain speaking. She turned and walked out. The door settled shut behind her, not a slam, a controlled click, which in its own way was worse. Through the window I tracked her crossing the gravel, pulling open the door of the black SUV. She sat down inside. The engine did not turn over. She just sat. Gil moved up beside me. She's not gone, he said. No, I said. She's working something out. What it is I don't know yet. What I came to know later because Nadia filled me in afterward is exactly what Vivienne Wexford did inside that SUV over the following 11 minutes. She drew out her phone. She pulled up a search browser and keyed in my name. The top result was the Architectural Digest piece that had run 14 months earlier under the heading Oregon's Hidden Master, Warren Callahan, and the Art of Silence. It included a photograph of the workshop on a winter afternoon, the December light coming in at the angle it takes that time of year. There was a photograph of the walnut library wall I had built for Burke Ingstrom's home in Medford, and Burke's own words quoted at length, I have been on a waiting list for 2 years to work with Warren Callahan. I would wait another 2 without hesitation. What he makes is not furniture. It is time made solid. There was also a quote from a collector in New York, a woman named Audra Finch. I own 4 pieces. I have never once considered parting with any of them. You do not sell a Callahan. Nadia told me Vivienne held that phone for the full 11 minutes. Then she started the engine. Then she sat motionless for another 3 minutes. Then she drove away. The days that followed her visit had a texture to them, not silent, not still, but dense, the way air thickens and presses down before a storm comes in off the mountains. The whole world seemed to slow down and press in at once. Nadia sat across from Elliot Voss that Thursday morning, an appointment I'd arranged while I waited in the truck outside his building for an hour and 20 minutes. Walking out, she wore the expression of someone who has just been handed a truth they needed and quietly dreaded, clearer, more worn. She kept most of what Elliot told her to herself. I didn't press. What she offered was, the process made sense to her now, and knowing what was coming was easier than living in the fog of not knowing. Hard, yes, but knowable. Colin, meanwhile, had phoned his mother twice that same week. I only knew because Gil had noticed him both times out in the gravel drive with the phone against his ear, same angled stance as always turned a little away, free hand tracing shapes in the air while he spoke. What those calls contained wasn't my business. I left it alone. Come Friday, I was at the bench before 6 finishing work on the Grants Pass cabinets by lamp, because the sun doesn't get above the ridge line until close to 7 this time's year. Nadia's bedroom door opened at 6:43. Footsteps to the kitchen. The coffee maker ran. Then her steps went quiet. Then nothing, and the silence held long enough that I put down what I was holding and walked to the kitchen doorway. She was at the counter gripping her phone with both hands, coffee sitting cold and untouched at her elbow. Her expression had gone blank in that particular way, the look of someone whose mind is still processing what their eyes have read. "Nadia?" She raised her head. No tears, but the flesh around her eyes had drawn tight. "They let me go," she said. A formal letter. Irene Cassell, HR manager. Effective immediately. She turned her gaze back to the screen. Section 4.2, misrepresentation of job title across internal records and outside communications. Then she laid the phone face down on the counter, slowly and precisely, like she was setting something fragile to rest. I've been sitting on paid leave for 2 weeks bracing for this, and I still wasn't ready for it. I held my position in the doorway. "I'm sorry," I said. Both palms went flat on the counter as she dropped her eyes to the space between them. One slow rise and fall of her shoulders. "I told people I was a director," she said. "I told HR I was a director. I put it in emails. I put it in my employee profile." A long exhale. I knew when I did it that it wasn't true. She stopped. "I figured that if I carried myself that way long enough, the title would catch up to the claim. Or it wouldn't matter anymore. Either way." I held my tongue. She wasn't done. "It mattered," she said. "Yes," I said. "It did." She lifted the mug and took a drink. Her hands didn't shake, which told me some part of her had been steeling herself for this, even through the hoping. My phone rang at 9:17. Warren, Elliott Voss. "The ruling came down this morning on the Quill Private Lending LLC foreclosure petition. Multnomah County Circuit Court has signed off on the foreclosure. The property is going to public auction. Between the remaining loan balance, accrued interest, late fees, and court costs, whatever Nadia nets from the sale will almost certainly be nothing." I drifted to the threshold between the workshop and the kitchen, standing in neither space but in Nadia's sightline, without planting myself in front of her. "What does the schedule look like?" I asked. In Multnomah County, the auction typically runs 60 to 90 days out from the court order. That window belongs to her. A beat of silence. She should understand she's under no legal obligation to leave until the title actually changes hands after the sale. But realistically, there's nothing waiting for her there. When the auction closes, her stake in that property is finished. "Understood," I said. "I'll let her know." I hung up, stood there a moment. Nadia had her eyes on me. She'd caught enough fragments of the call to read the outline even without the details. The court approved it. She said yes. Auction 60 to 90 days out. Elliott says whatever the house brings will clear the debt. Nothing left over to owe. She took that in. I watched her absorb it the same way she'd always absorbed hard things since she was small, drawing inward, going very still, the way a tree locks its roots in a gale without the trunk giving way. "So I have no job," she said, "and no house." "That's right." Her gaze drifted to the kitchen window, the workshop roof, the snow blanketing it, the tree line behind. "What do I do now?" Not really a question aimed at me, more at the window, the morning, whatever in the universe fields that kind of reckoning. "Right now," I said, "you drink your coffee." She looked over at me. Something moved across her face. Not a smile, more like the memory of one buried deep. And after the coffee, she asked, "After the coffee?" I said, "You get Elliott on the phone, find out what the next step is, and you take it." She wrapped both hands around the mug. She drank looking outside. The sun had finally crested the ridge, laying a wide, flat band of light along the snow. Everything briefly hammered gold before the angle slipped, and the morning became itself again. I turned back to the cabinet hinges. A moment later, I heard Nadia behind me dialing. Vivian Wexford returned 4 days after that. No warning call this time. No charcoal wrap coat. No architectural bag. No entrance stage for effect. Dark blazer, plain shirt, a single manila folder under her arm. She arrived in the early evening when the light from the workshop was burning and visible from the road. I heard her tires on the gravel. Then a knock not at the front door of the house. At the workshop door. That choice told me she decided to skip the formalities altogether. I opened it. "I'd like to sit down with Nadia and Colin," she said. "Together, if that works." I went and got them. They emerged from the back room carrying the particular strained closeness of two people who have exhausted every conversation between them, but have no exit from the same four walls. The look on Colin's face when he registered his mother, I hadn't seen that expression on him before. Not relief, not guilt. Something closer to the bone, the hollow fatigue of a man who has spent too long waiting for an inevitable moment to arrive. Vivian set the folder on the kitchen table without sitting. "I had an Oregon State family law attorney draw these up," she said. "Colin has gone through them." She turned to Nadia. "Dissolution of marriage documents. Oregon is a no-fault state. Neither party has to prove anything. The filing lists irreconcilable differences." Nadia looked at the folder, then at Colin. Colin's gaze stayed on the table. "Colin?" Her voice was level. Holding it that way took something out of her, you could tell. "Is this what you want?" He lifted his eyes. "What I found in them wasn't what I expected. Not resolve, not distance, but a soft, helpless grief. The face of a man who has finally admitted to himself that he cannot rise to what this moment needs and has stopped pretending he can. "I don't know how to make this right," he said. "I don't know how to fix any of it. And he broke off. His jaw tightened. "I don't think my staying here makes things better." "For you," Nadia said quietly. "It doesn't make it better for you." He didn't argue, which was, I thought, the most truthful thing he'd managed since he walked through the door. Vivian placed a pen on the folder with the brisk precision of a woman who is determined that feeling sorry for people isn't going to help anyone here. Nadia slid the folder toward herself and opened it. She didn't skim, not the way she'd been moving through documents for the past year without really reading them. She went page by page, deliberate, her fingers trailing each line, the way it does when she needs to be certain she's understood. 11 minutes. I tracked the time against the clock mounted on the workshop wall. She signed where indicated. Then she closed the folder and pushed it back. "The paperwork goes through the Oregon State Court," Vivian said, collecting the folder. "Since neither party is disputing anything, finalization should land within 90 days. She studied Nadia with a look that was careful rather than cruel, but carried no warmth either. "I want to be clear about something. I don't believe you're a bad person, Nadia. I think you reached for things before you were ready, and the choices you made left damage behind, including for yourself." A pause. "I'd ask that you make other arrangements for tonight." Nadia held her gaze. "This isn't your house," she said. "No," Vivian said. "It isn't." She gathered her folder and coat, and for just a beat, her eyes found mine. Something crossed her face, not quite an apology, more like the ghost of a truth she wasn't willing to claim out loud. Then her gaze dropped. She brushed a hand against Colin's arm as she moved past him. He didn't move. The door pulled shut. Colin folded himself into a kitchen chair and pressed his face into his palms. His shoulders trembled once, twice, then went quiet. When he raised his eyes, they were bloodshot, but his voice came out level. "I'm sorry," he said, looking at Nadia. "I should have stepped up a long time before this." "Yes," Nadia said. "You should have." No heat in it, which I think landed heavier than fury would have. Colin gave a slow nod, then got to his feet. He went down to the spare room and returned dragging the leather duffel and the carry-on both, because his mother had evidently made the arrangements already, and tonight was the night he was going. He paused at the front door and faced me. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I'm sorry for your trouble." I nodded, the right words delivered too late and carrying too little weight. He walked out. Vivian's SUV was still sitting in the drive. The two vehicles left together, and the crunch of gravel faded until there was nothing. Nadia remained in the kitchen motionless for a moment. She reached for her coffee mug, empty since morning, and wrapped both hands around it the same way she'd been cradling things since the day she arrived, as if holding on to something solid was the closest she could get to keeping herself upright. She stared at the door, then at me. "I know this isn't," she began. "The spare room is where it was this morning." "Nothing's changed about that," I told her. Her lips pressed together. Her eyes went glassy but held. "Go to bed, Nadia," I said, and I kept my voice gentle about it. "Tomorrow will be a long one. Sleep matters more right now than anything the two of us could say to each other." She lingered a little longer. Then the mug went back on the counter, and she disappeared down the hall. I killed the kitchen light and returned to the workshop. The cabinet hinges sat exactly as I'd left them. I went back to work. Outside, the rain that had spent all day making threats finally followed through a steady tap against the workshop roof, the kind of cadence that tells you it's settled in for the duration. The weeks after that had a shape to them I hadn't foreseen. Nadia was up early each morning. Not as early as me, I'm at the bench by 5:30, a rhythm I've kept for 37 years, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone with the option of sleeping later. But most days by 7, she was already at the kitchen table, coffee at her elbow. Documents spread in front of her, working through what Elliot Voss had laid out for her step by step. There was an order to it. Answer the court filing document, her finances gear up for the auction. She moved through each stage the way she always moved through hard things when no one was watching steadily without drama. She never asked me for money, never asked for much of anything, and I suspect that restraint cost her more than a direct request would have. I offered what I could without stepping over the boundary Elliot Voss had set shelter food, the truck when she needed to reach town. One afternoon, she came back from his office with a particular look on her face, not broken, but the color of someone who has absorbed something difficult and is keeping the weight of it very carefully distributed. I sat her down at the kitchen table and put a bowl of soup in front of her before she was allowed near any paperwork. She didn't push back, which told me she was running closer to empty than she was showing. Gil stopped by on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after Colin's departure and said he'd picked up something through a contact he had over in Medford. Colin had put money into a tech startup. Last year, he said, borrowed against a personal line of credit to fund it. The company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy last month. Chapter 7. In the United States, that's a liquidation. The company's assets get sold off to cover what's owed, and whatever gap remains gets discharged. For the people who invested it, means the money has vanished. No payment plan, no recovery, no quarter where things turn around. The stake simply stops existing. How much? I asked. Enough that he's moved back in with his mother, Gil said, and enough that his mother is apparently dealing with some liquidity problems of her own. I set the hand plane down on the bench. She's coming back, I said. That's my read, Gil said. She came on a Thursday afternoon 2 days after that conversation. No warning call, same as before, but the feeling around it was entirely different. The black rental was gone. In its place sat her own car, a silver Mercedes, carrying the slightly worn look of something that had covered a lot of miles without a recent visit to a detailer. She eased it into a spot and walked to the workshop entrance. She looked changed. The coat was the same caliber as before, but it hung on her differently the way a garment shifts when the person wearing it has misplaced some of the confidence that used to give it shape. Her hair was tended, but with none of the precision from her first visit. She carried her own bag this time, rather than the structured one, and it pulled at her shoulder. Warren, she said, I was hoping we could speak. I moved back from the doorway. Come in. She stepped inside. Her eyes traveled the workshop more slowly than they had the first time, the way you take in a space when you're trying to reckon with what it's worth, rather than simply file it away. Gil was at the far end where he usually was. He gave her a nod. She returned it, and this time the gesture carried something approaching real acknowledgement. I owe you an apology, she said. The words came out rehearsed, not hollow, but deliberate the way you speak when you know the landing matters. The last time I was here, I was hunting for a solution. I treated you the way you treat a tool, not a person. That was wrong. I let the silence sit to see whether she was finished. She wasn't. I've also been turning over what I said to Nadia across the years. She continued, the things I implied about what her family was or wasn't about where she came from. Her lips drew tight. I called it having standards. It was unkind. That's what it was. From the doorway at the back of the room, I became aware that Nadia was there. She'd materialized quietly the way she sometimes did when she needed to watch something unfold rather than be part of it. Vivienne noticed her. Something moved behind Vivienne's eyes, not the composed, managed version of herself she'd brought last time, but something raw, and I think it caught Vivienne off guard as much as anyone. I'm sorry, Nadia, she said, for more than I could put into a list. Nadia held her gaze for a long moment. Okay, she said, not warm, not cold, just okay, honest. It was enough. Vivienne turned back to me. I'd like to ask, she said, whether you'd consider a commission a dining table for my home. I know your list is long and I know I have no place on it. I still wanted to ask. A beat. I'll pay whatever your going rate is. I held her gaze. She didn't look away, didn't waver, and I gave her credit for that. 2 years, I said. That's where the list sits. I don't move people up for timing. She took that in. Is there a way to get onto it? There's a request form on my website, I said. Gil can give you the address. If the project seems like something I want to build, I'll be in touch when I have a gap. She looked toward Gil. He took a carpenter's pencil, wrote the address on a piece of scrap trim, and offered it across without any fuss. Vivienne considered the strip of wood for a moment. Then it went into her bag. Thank you, she said. Not the automatic kind. The kind that comes when someone receives a small thing and understands precisely that it was more than they had coming. She left. This time the car pulled away immediately. Nadia came and stood next to me at the bench. I didn't see that coming, she said. People will do that, I said. She was quiet. Then, Elliot Voss called this morning. The auction date is set 62 days out. She paused. How do you feel about that? She gave the question the weight it deserved before she answered. Like a door closing, she said, and I can't yet see what's on the other side. I picked up the hand plane. That's generally the way of it. The auction fell on a Tuesday. I know this because Elliot Voss rang me at 2:17 in the afternoon to say it was done. I remember glancing at the clock on the workshop wall when the phone went off the way you fix a moment in place so you can locate it later. 2:17 on a Tuesday late spring. The light coming through the window at that angle that tells you the morning is gone for good, but the afternoon still has room in it. The property sold, Elliot said. $419,000. Once the outstanding loan balance, accrued interest, late fees, attorney costs, and court filing fees were taken out, the net remainder, coming to Nadia, was approximately $412. I let that sit for a moment. $412. Correct. I'll move it to the account she designated. The debt to Quill Private Lending LLC is fully discharged. The court case is closed. He paused. She has no remaining legal obligations tied to this matter. Thank you, Elliot. Warren. He held the beat the way he did when he was about to step slightly past the edge of legal advice. She handled herself well throughout this. Every appointment she was there. The questions she asked were the right ones. She made the process easier than it had any reason to be. Another pause. That's worth saying. I thanked him again and set the phone down. I went to find Nadia. She wasn't in the kitchen, not in the spare room either. The truck was sitting in the drive, so she hadn't gone anywhere. I spotted her through the back window of the workshop. She was outside on the woodpile, perched on the flat tops of the stacked cedar rounds I keep for the workshop stove jacket, on hands folded between her knees, face tipped up toward the sky. I watched her for a moment through the glass. She wasn't crying, she wasn't reading. She was simply sitting the way a person sits when they've come through something very hard and their body hasn't yet caught up to the fact that it's finished. I went back to work. Gil showed up at 3, which was either coincidence or the finely tuned instinct he'd developed over 19 years for appearing when something had just shifted. It's done, I said. House sold. Debt cleared. He nodded slowly. Nadia's outside, I said. On the woodpile. He looked through the back window, held his gaze on her for a moment, then turned to his hardware cabinet and began sorting something that didn't obviously require sorting, which is what Gil does when he wants to give someone space while making sure he's still in the room. Nadia came in about 20 minutes later. Her cheeks were wind-reddened from sitting out in the spring air, and her eyes were dry and clear. She stood in the workshop doorway in her jacket and her socks. She'd begun leaving her shoes at the back step sometime in the last few weeks, without ever deciding to the way habits settle in when you've stopped being a guest. She looked at me. Elliot called you, she said. He did. 4:12, she said. Yes. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, close enough to carry the same quality, that sudden involuntary release of pressure. I had more than that in my checking account when I was 19. She said, working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop and convinced I was broke. She shook her head slow. 412 and a suitcase and no job. That's where I am. That's where you are, I said. She studied my face, trying to work out whether I was being cruel or practical. She landed on both, which was right. Is that survivable? She asked. It was the same question Elliot Voss had told me she'd put to him weeks earlier, back when she first began to see clearly what the end of this process would look like. I thought about the fact that she'd been carrying that question for weeks, asking it quietly of the people she trusted enough to ask. The people come through worse every day, I said, and they start with less. She nodded. She lowered herself onto the stool near the bench, the one Gil usually takes, and put her elbows on her knees and her face into her hands. Not crying, just setting the weight down somewhere for a minute. Gil put aside whatever he'd been handling and moved to the small cabinet near the back, where I keep a bottle of decent rye whiskey for the end of jobs that went well and the end of jobs that went badly, on the grounds that both deserve to be marked. He poured 2 small glasses and placed one on the bench near Nadia's elbow without a word. She looked at it. She picked it up. Gil raised his own glass slightly toward her. She drank. He drank. I went back to the cabinet doors I'd been fitting since morning, because the Grants Pass job was 2 days from done, and the clients had waited long enough, and the work doesn't hold still for the world being complicated. After a while, Nadia said, I need to find a job. Yes, I said. And somewhere to live, she said. Eventually? Not tonight, I said. Not tonight, she agreed. The afternoon moved on. The light through the workshop window changed the way it does in late spring, unhurried, almost reluctant, as though the day isn't ready to give up the evening just yet. At some point, Nadia picked up a sheet of sandpaper from the bench and began running it along the edge of a cabinet door piece I'd set aside for finish work. She didn't ask. She just started the way you do things in a place once you've stopped being careful about your presence and begun simply occupying it. She was doing it wrong. Too much pressure, wrong angle, working against the grain in a way that would have left its mark if she'd kept at it. I walked over and adjusted her hand without saying anything. She shifted her angle. She kept going. We worked without talking until Gil said he was heading home for dinner and headed out. And then we kept working, just the two of us, the wood, the light, and the quiet sound of tools finding their purpose. That cedar box sat in my workshop for a long time after all of this was done. I looked at it more than I worked on it. There is something in this story, in Warren's story, that I think a lot of us who are part of that adults 50-plus generation will recognize. The cost of loving someone who cannot yet see you clearly. The cost of staying quiet when speaking might have changed things. And the harder truth, sometimes staying quiet is the only dignified thing left to do. I believe God has a way of bringing things to light in their own time, and this story is evidence of that. The $38,000 check that never left the box, the Instagram post that unraveled a title built on nothing, the auction gavel that ended what a housewarming party began. None of it forced, all of it inevitable. If this family revenge story moved something in you, here is what I would offer. Do not let pride at a doorstep make the decision that your whole life has to live with. When someone shows you who they believe you are, believe them the first time and protect yourself accordingly. A gift withheld at the right moment is not cruelty, it is self-respect. And if you are standing in the rubble of choices you cannot undo, start with the stool by the workbench, the sandpaper, and the next small thing in front of you. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you longest. And if you haven't already subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, there are more of these waiting for you. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take good care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.